So after we've used the grinders during class, the counter area might look something like this. It'll have quite a bit of water on the counter because when we are running the grinders, it's spinning, so the water from the basin in here tends to kind of fling outward. And that's totally fine. That's why we're doing it on the countertop here, so that we can clean it up. But we need to make sure when we have, after we've used the grinders, at the end of class, we are cleaning up all the different parts, taking it apart and storing it back down in the cabinet here where the grinders go. So we are going to take a look at the specifics of cleaning all the different things and all the different parts of this. So we got a lot of water on the counter here. There's a lot of glass dust. Anywhere where there is water, you can pretty much bet on the fact that there is glass dust in that. So if we left this just like this, the water would eventually evaporate and it would leave the glass dust on the counter. And we really don't want to have that left there because that is potentially hazardous to breathe in. We want to make sure all the glass dust is going with the water down in the drain so that we don't have to have that airborne and potentially be breathing in glass. And so when it dries, it tends to look more like the color of the glass that was ground down, but frequently a whitish color. So all of this on the back here is all glass dust. So we want to make sure not only does the water go down the drain, but any glass dust that's in the water and any glass dust that's potentially dried on the wall here. So first thing with the grinder, we want to unplug it so that we can move it around a little better. And we want to take it apart. The other grinders are shaped a little bit differently, but they work the same way. They all have a little tray on the top, a little grate. The more rectangular ones just have the more rectangular grates to them. So either way, you want to take off the grate, and we want to thoroughly clean that. So those are already clean, but this one I just took off the grinder. So I'm going to take it to the sink and I'm going to thoroughly rinse it. If it looks like there's any residue on there that's not wanting to come off, you can take a rag and just wipe it a little bit while it's under the running water to make sure any of that residue, any of that glass dust is going down the drain. So now that that's all rinsed off, I'm going to stick it back over here with the other grates for the grinder. And then I'm going to take the sponge here. It's still wet from soaking up all the water in the basin. And so what I want to do is rinse that off, give it a few squeezes under the water to make sure all of that glass dust that's potentially in the sponge with the water is also going down the drain. And then in our little basket with the grinder bits, we have the Allen wrenches. And so just like when we put on the grinder bit, we want to use the Allen wrench to take that off as well. So I'm going to turn it counterclockwise to loosen it. And on the grinder bit is a little set screw in here. So we want to loosen it just enough with the Allen wrench so that it will come off the little post here on the grinder. You don't want to keep loosening it until you start to see the little set screw come out. The set screw will just keep loosening until it totally falls out, but it's really tiny, and if it falls out, we could potentially lose it, and then this grinder bit won't work. So we want to make sure that we're loosening it just enough that it comes off of the post on the grinder, not to the point where the screw comes out. So now I have the grinder bit off of the grinder, but a lot of times, even if you can't see it on the grinder bit, it's wet, so it's usually covered in glass dust as well. So it's always a good idea to give it a quick little rinse under the sink, under the water in the sink, and stick that back in the little basket here. So now we got the grate put away and rinsed, the grinder sponges, and the grinder bits. So at this point, it's unplugged. It's pretty much just the grinder itself. And so what we want to do is we want to make sure that the water doesn't get inside the components inside the grinder, but we can still kind of scooch it down towards the sink, and we just want to kind of pour that water into the sink. The other style grinders, the rectangular ones, have a little plug in them in the bottom, but we can just dump it the same way. Just take it to the sink, tip it until all that water comes out. All that water, remember, has glass in it, little bits of glass dust. We want to make sure that's going in the sink. And any wet part of the surface here could still have glass dust in it. Sometimes it'll be all gunked up around where the grinder bit goes or where the sponge goes. And it'll look kind of like a paste. Sometimes it just looks like water, but when it dries, it'll have that glass dust. So we want to just take a rag, and we have lots of rags over here. We have some that are hanging up to dry here. We want to make sure any wet rags are going onto the nails onto the wall here. The extra ones that are dry are in the basket here, but whenever you need a rag, you can always grab the ones up here. They are all clean. So they might still be wet from the last person that used them, or they might have dried since then. But everything should be thoroughly rinsed, ready to use rags. And so I have one here that's wet, and I am just going to get a little bit of water on that rag, rinse off any glass dust or kind of gunk out of the basin here. It's looking pretty clean, but it looks like there is a little bit of buildup around here. So I'm going to give that a quick little scrub with the washcloth and make sure all of that is going down in the sink. You can also get the washcloth or the rag here really saturated with water and kind of squeeze it over the top to kind of rinse that out. And give it a nice little wipe on here. Looks like the cord has a little bit of glass dust on it, so I'm just going to wipe that off as well so that that is nice and clean and doesn't have any of that hazardous glass dust on it. So once it's totally clean, then I'm going to stick it down in the cabinet here. And so the grinder and all the parts of the grinder are now cleaned, taken apart, put away, but that is only half of the cleanup. We still have this whole counter space here that is covered in water and glass dust. And so for this part of the cleanup, we want to be using the rags. So we don't want to be using the paper towels here. Paper towels are just for kind of drying your hands after you wash your hands, things like that. We want to avoid any paper towels being used when cleaning up the glass dust. Even when you're using the grinder, if there's any excess water and you kind of want to mop it up while you're working with the grinder, just grab some of the dry rags. The paper towels just kind of mush it all around, just kind of move it on the counter. It doesn't actually absorb it very well or clean up any of the glass dust. So we're just going to toss that in the trash, a paper towel, and we are going to just stick with the rags. So when cleaning this up, a lot of times it's a really big puddle happening on the counter here. So what works best to get all that glass dust to move towards the sink and kind of mop all the water into the sink is to take a slightly damp rag here and just kind of squeegee almost the water into the sink. So kind of just swoop this way with the rag. So I'm going to start over here, and I just have the rag kind of like this, and I am going to just kind of push all the water into the sink. So that guarantees that that glass dust is going in there as well. If we just take a rag or a dry rag and just kind of spin around in circles with the rag like this, it's just going to kind of push that glass dust around, and it's not going to actually come off of the counter. But we want to make sure it's coming off the counter and it's going into the sink, so we're just going to kind of act like a snowplow here and just kind of scoop it into the sink. And it does help to rinse the rag in between kind of strokes across the counter. So I've rinsed it off, and so I'm going to start back over here. Otherwise, if we have a lot of glass dust on the rag, it could potentially then just be bringing more of it over here and kind of smearing it across the counter. So you want to scoop all the glass dust and water into the sink and then give it a rinse. Kind of squeeze it out a few times. Make sure it's nice and thoroughly rinsed out. Wring it out so there's not a whole lot of water in it. And then go back over here and wipe down the sink this way. And just rinse out that rag again. And so everything we do is going to be kind of in this motion towards the sink. Even when we are wiping down the wall. So we want to make sure the wall is getting wiped down as well. And so it's a ledge here on the backsplash of the wall. So I'm wiping that off. And all of this is all glass dust that you couldn't even see when it was super wet at first when the grinder was being used. So it looked just like water, but it's really all of this. So we want to make sure that anywhere where there's water, there is also glass dust. So that all needs to go down the drain in the sink. So thoroughly rinse that off. And continuing in that motion towards the sink, I'm going to kind of flop this over to a clean side of the rag. Wipe down the wall a little bit more. Rinse that off. And then just keep going until all of that is wiped down off of the wall, off of the counter. And a lot of times the grinders, they will kind of spray it a little bit to the side as well. So we have quite a bit happening under the soap dispenser here, under the towel dispenser, all of this. I want to make sure we're getting cleaned up. And thoroughly rinsing the rag in between each time you're wiping down the counter. And if there's any on the faucet, any of it around the sink here, we want to make sure we're getting all of that too. And that's looking pretty good. Sometimes some glass dust ends up kind of on this side of the sink too, over here. Just from people using the different rags while using the grinder. So we just want to double check over here that everything's getting wiped up here as well. And just kind of wiping everything down this way towards the sink. And it's starting to look pretty good here. Things are looking pretty clean. And so this rag is pretty much done using this rag, so I'm going to give it one last thorough rinsing, squeeze out all the water, rinse it some more, squeeze out the water, wring it out, and then I'm going to hang it up on a nail up here. But it looks like all the nails have rags on them, so I'm just going to take down one of the dry, clean ones. This one's nice and dry, so that can go in the basket here of dry rags. I'm going to hang up the wet rags. So we want any wet rags to be up on the wall. If we put them all in a little basket, they're going to stay really compact. And they're going to stay wet and they can potentially mold. So that's why we only want the dry rags in this and the wet rags up here on the wall to let them dry. So if you ever need a rag, even if they're wet still on the wall, they're still clean. So if you need a rag to be wet to wipe up any messes during class, you can always use those up there. You don't have to grab a new dry one down in the basket. But we have our wet rags up here, and then it looks like someone might have left this rag here. It's a little sparkly, so that tells me that it has some glass dust on it. So that might have been from someone using the grinder and just drying off the pieces of glass after grinding them. And so to avoid any glass dust on the rags like that, we want to make sure that when you are setting up the grinder, using the grinder, if your piece of glass is going to be wet from being on the grinder. So after you are done with the grinder, you want to just take that glass piece to the sink and rinse that off. Because just like the counter, if it has any water on it, that's going to have some glass dust residue on it, and when it dries, your glass piece is also going to have glass dust on it, and we want to avoid having that glass dust travel around the classroom or travel home with you when you take your piece home. So anytime that you're using the grinder, you can always use rags to mop things up, but we want to rinse that off, the rag that is, we want to rinse off the rags, but we also want to rinse off the actual pieces of glass that we are using as well on the grinder. So I'm just going to rinse this rag since it looks like it has some glass dust on it. Squeeze it out a few times as I'm going, making sure that's all rinsed off. Bring that out, and I'm going to take this one down and hang this one up. And so now the counter's nice and clean, everything's safe, free of all that glass dust, and the counter's nice and clean and ready for the next class period.